Madam President, more than 40 years ago, in New York Times versus Sullivan, Justice William Brennan described, quote, a profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open, unquote. The measure now before the Senate shows that this commitment is in serious jeopardy. Madam President, next week marks the 227th anniversary of the drafting of the United States Constitution. Those who participated in that process agreed that individual liberty requires limits on government power, but they differed on how explicit and extensive those limits should be. Many thought that the simple act of delegating enumerated powers to the federal government and reserving the rest to the states would be enough. Others were more skeptical of government power and insisted that the Constitution needed a Bill of Rights. Those skeptics, however, were not skeptical enough. The measure before us today, Senate Joint Resolution 19, would allow the government to control and even prohibit what Americans say and do in the political process. Yesterday, a member of the majority leadership said that this measure is, quote, narrowly tailored, unquote. It is possible to believe that only if you have never read Senate Joint Resolution 19 and know nothing about either the Supreme Court's precedents or past proposals of this kind. This is not the first attempt at empowering government to suppress political speech, but it is the most extreme. 4 elements of this proposal are particularly troubling. First, its purpose is to advance what it calls, quote, political equality, unquote. None of the constitutional amendments previously proposed to control political speech has made such a claim. The irony here is astounding. At the very time in our history when technology is naturally leveling the political playing field, this proposal would give the power to define political equality to government. If simply suggesting that the government should have the power to enforce its own version of political equality is not enough to oppose this proposal, then our liberties are even in greater danger than I thought. In addition to its stated purpose, this proposal is also troubling because of the power it would give to government. Past proposals of this kind were very specific about what government could or should regulate. One measure, for example, covered expenditures made, quote, to expressly advocate the election or defeat of a clearly identified candidate for federal office, unquote. More recently, proposed amendments covered expenditures made, quote, in support of or in opposition to a candidate, unquote. The proposal before us today is, however, says that government may regulate, quote, the raising and spending of money by candidates and others to influence elections, unquote. That's all it says. It would allow government to control raising and spending of money by anyone doing anything at any time to influence elections. No proposal of this kind has ever been drafted more broadly. The same Democrat senator who yesterday claimed this proposal is narrowly tailored referred to big money campaign donors, high rollers, and for-profit corporations with unlimited budgets. I urge not only my colleagues, but everyone listening to this debate to read Senate Joint Resolution 19. Just read it. My liberal friends may want to paint certain billionaires or for-profit corporations as the big bad wolf, but this proposal goes far beyond that. It would allow government to regulate raising and spending money not only by billionaires or corporations, but by what it simply labels others. That means everyone, everywhere. It means individuals as well as groups, rich as well as poor, for-profits, nonprofits. Under this proposal, government could control them all. It takes no imagination whatsoever to realize that virtually everything can influence elections. voter registration drives, get out the vote efforts, nonpartisan voter information, discussion about issues, town meetings. All of these activities and many, many more influence elections. Once again, I urge everyone to read the proposal before us. It would give government the power to regulate anything done by anyone at any time to influence elections. The third troubling element of this proposal is that it would suppress the First Amendment freedom of speech for individual citizens, but protect the First Amendment freedom of the press for big media. Supporters of this amendment want to manipulate and control how individual citizens influence elections, but are perfectly happy with how big media influences elections. This proposal would allow government to prohibit nonprofit organizations from raising or spending a single dollar to influence elections, but leaves multi-billion-dollar media corporations free to influence elections as much as they choose. That set of priorities represents a twisted sense of political equality that I cannot believe most Americans share. Finally, this proposal would allow government to distinguish between what it calls natural persons and, quote, corporations or other artificial entities created by law, unquote. Unlike other provisions of the Bill of Rights, such as the Fourth or Fifth Amendments, the First Amendment does not use the word person. It simply protects the freedom of speech, a freedom that obviously can be exercised not only individually, but also collectively. Yesterday, a Democrat senator dismissed the notion that corporations can be treated as, quote, persons, unquote, under the law because corporations never get married, raise kids, or care for sick relatives. Is he kidding? The corporation cannot care for sick relatives, but it certainly can speak, and that is what this debate is all about. As the Supreme Court observed more than a century ago, corporations are, quote, merely associations of individuals, unquote. And perhaps I need to remind my colleagues that the first section of the first title of the United States Code is the Dictionary Act. It defines the word person to include, quote, corporations, companies, associations, firms, partnerships, societies, and joint stock companies, as well as individuals, unquote. Many of what this proposal labels artificial entities, such as nonprofit organizations, associations, or societies, exist to magnify the voices of individuals. The Supreme Court case that sparked this debate, Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, was brought not by a for-profit corporation, but by a nonprofit organization. Senate Joint Resolution 19 would allow government not only to regulate, but to prohibit the raising or spending of money by these nonprofits, associations, and societies to influence elections. They can be banned from speaking on behalf of what my Democrat colleagues like to refer to as ordinary average citizens, Americans. Suppressing the speech of organizations that speak for individuals would leave millions of those Americans with no voice at all. We should eliminate rather than create barriers to participation in the political process. We should encourage rather than discourage activities by our fellow citizens to influence the election of their leaders. We should prohibit rather than empower government to control how Americans participate in the political process. We should, to return to Justice Brennan's words, strengthen rather than dismantle our national commitment to uninhibited, robust, and wide-open debate on public issues. Making Senate Joint Resolution 19 part of the Constitution would instead make that debate inhibited, weak, and closed. As the Supreme Court has recognized, the First Amendment is premised on a mistrust of government power. Neither the nature of government power nor its impact on individual liberty has changed. Senate Joint Resolution 19 therefore proves three things. It proves that the government's temptation to control what Americans say and do in the political process is as strong as ever. It proves that the majority believes it can retain power only by suppressing the liberties of our fellow Americans. And it believes that the profound national consensus that Justice Brennan described may no longer exist. Another irony here is that the majority in what we often call the Senate, the world's greatest deliberative body, is trying to stifle the free speech of citizens with whom they disagree. This is nothing more than election year misdirection, an attempt to distract attention from the majority's complete failures to address the real problems facing our nation. We should heed the advice of our late colleague from Massachusetts, my friend, Senator Ted Kennedy. We were often called the odd couple because we worked so well together, but came from disparate or different political areas. In March 1997, this body was debating another proposed constitutional amendment to control political speech. That measure, I want my colleagues to know, was more narrowly drawn than the one before us today. It was limited to expenditures supporting or opposing candidates and did not exempt big media. Yet Senator Kennedy rose to oppose it and said, quote, "In the entire history of the Constitution, we have never amended the Bill of Rights, and now is no time to start." And he was right. And it would be wrong to carve an exception in the First Amendment. Campaign finance reform is a serious problem, but it does not require that we twist the meaning of the Constitution, unquote. All of this was said by Senator Kennedy. The Senate voted 38-61 against that proposal, and Senator Kennedy's words apply with even more force today. No question about it. The real purpose of Senate Joint Resolution 19 is exactly what America's founders ratified in the it's exactly what America's founders ratified the First Amendment to prevent. Supporters of this radical proposal apparently believe that freedom itself is the problem. That view is contrary to the most fundamental principles of this republic and incompatible with free society. Freedom is not a problem. It's the solution. And I'm really amazed that my colleagues on the other side would attempt to pull this stunt at this time in our country's history, when almost anybody who looks at it knows that it's done just for publicity and political reasons. And at the same time, what an awful amendment it is. It makes you wonder if people in the Congress today are really as serious about our country as they were back at the beginning of this country. Those people didn't have nearly the knowledge or the books and learning and capacities that we have today. But for some reason, they were inspired. They were well educated. They were strong people. They knew what was right, and they stood up for what was right. And they did it in very carefully selected words that would be surely diminished by what the Democrats are trying to do here today. I sometimes wonder, is politics more important than the Constitution? They know they're not going to pass this resolution. We're not going to let them pass it. It's crazy. It's wrong. It's out of whack. It's against almost everything the Founding Fathers stood for. It's against Supreme Court precedent. It basically would limit the rights of far too many people. Madam President, I know my colleagues are going to ultimately vote this down. This will never get 67 votes. It never should. It never should have seen the light of day. It never should have seen a minute on the floor of this august body. It diminishes this body to have this type of amendment brought to the floor of the United States Senate. With that, I suggest the absence of a quorum.